Sure. My name is Marc Berenson. My book is titled Taxes and Trust: From Coercion to Compliance in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Well, the book is looking at three important post-communist cases and trying to figure out what leads to good governance. How can states actually implement the policies and rules that they adopt? And what accounts for the variation across these important cases. And specifically, I've chosen tax compliance, the state's ability to collect taxes and ensure that people are paying taxes, as the policy of choice, because it's a very important one, both for state coffers to be filled in order for the state to be able to engage and conduct any activity, but also because it's one of the only few activities that citizens take up in which they have to give something over to the state itself. So the question that the book is focused on is, why are some post-communist states able to implement policies that lead to greater tax compliance than others? And I'm focusing on the cases of Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, which are in many ways consist of two polar regime types. Poland, which has been in many cases a darling of the transitioning to a country that's been successful economically and with democracy up until recent years, and Russia, which is a much more authoritarian case, and finally Ukraine, which is a country that is transitioning in many ways from the post-communist, or rather the post-Soviet rule of law or order based upon corruption and coercion, towards one that's based on the rule of law. And in many ways, it has been struggling with this for a considerable period of time throughout the most of the transition since 1991. Essentially, Ukraine has had a lot of bad luck, if you would say. It's had a much more difficult transition than its neighbor to the west, Poland, and had a decade in the 90s in which there was very little movement to rebuild or recreate the state, and they allowed the state, they inherited it from the Soviet period, to sort of continue on in a social welfare bureaucratic sense without much reform. And by and large, people in Ukraine rightly feel that they have not received much from the government, both in terms of how they're treated, whether they're treated fairly at an individual level, but also in terms of the goods and services that are provided to them. And they're much less satisfied in that respect than their neighbors to the east or west. And they've had a state that has not been reformed or been adequately strengthened enough to withstand outside pressures, if you will, such that Ukrainians know that if they do avoid contact with the state, but are caught, they generally can talk or negotiate their way out of it to a greater extent than per se in Russia. To address the notion that both Russia and both Russia and Poland have been effective in getting tax revenue, that is true, but I argue in the book that Poland has been much more successful than Russia because it is based on a state that has gone out and tried to educate its populace as to what are these new things called taxes, how do you pay for them, how do you engage with the state, and it's provided them with goods and services, and it's created a new state in the 1990s that was of, by, and for Poles for the first time in generations. Whereas the Russia state, in many ways, does not focus on trying to build trust between citizens and the state, and instead reinforces fear. And fear of getting caught with taxes is obviously a scary thing in Russia. And by invoking and provoking such fear, the state is able to get citizens to comply, but not as strongly as Poland. So Russia's at a suboptimal level. And in many ways, one can see how it would be difficult for those running the show in Russia to believe that they can translate switched or transitioned rather into a rule of law state like Poland because they fear very much the loss of control that they see in a case like Ukraine, which in many ways is caught in the middle between the two sort of paradigms, if you will. One of the things that they did in Poland that was dramatic, and I interviewed Polish bureaucrats in the tax offices, and I had tremendous access. They're very welcoming. I went there in the early 2000s, and I went to something like 18 offices across different cities. And the tax bureaucrats who were working in the early 2000s in Poland at the time had been there from the very beginning. Some of them had. And they talked about how they went on television, local TV, local radio, to go out and explain to people what is this new project called tax collection, how to take part in it. And they also had information booths set up in each tax office. And Poles know where their tax office is the way Americans or Canadians perhaps would know where their post office is. They're very familiar with it. And they were lenient in the first instance. They had they required individuals to file personal income tax forms and the like, but they showed them how to do this. And by the end of the 1990s, there was a survey in Poland in 1999 that the tax administration was the most favored bureaucracy or agency of the state in Poland. By and large, because people knew how to, they trusted the people with whom they interacted with. Moreover, as there are laws, similar laws in Russia and Ukraine, that if you were to file your taxes, you can get rebates for medical expenses, health expenses, education expenses. Within a few short years in the mid-90s, majority of Poles were taking advantage of these tax rebates because they were instructed and told how to do so. In Russia and Ukraine, they may exist on the books, but they're not followed in practice because nobody really knows about them. One of the things that was, I guess, innovative that I had to do in many ways was I had to go out and survey the general populations of the three countries. You would think perhaps there would be data on levels of tax compliance that the three different states have, but even if that data existed, you can't really access it. They don't give it over to outside independent researchers like myself. So I had to go ask people about their relationships with paying taxes, their attitudes towards paying taxes, and also their experiences with tax bureaucrats. And the Poles were much more positive in their evaluations of how they were treated by the tax bureaucrats than those who were in Russia or in Ukraine. One of the other interesting things that was really fascinating about the Ukrainian case, and I did 4 large-scale surveys with the Razumkov Center out of Kiev in Ukraine from 2005 up until 2015, was that at times, even those individuals who may be satisfied with how they were treated by tax bureaucrats in a more individual basis in Ukraine were still less likely to say that they would obey paying taxes in the future, very much unlike their counterparts in Russia and Poland. And that suggests that what mattered for these Ukrainian taxpayers, even if they got good service, their overwhelming perception of the state not providing them with goods and services and their distrust towards national politics as a whole and national politicians made them unwilling to obey the state even going forward. What is fascinating within Ukraine is that even those individuals who may be more fearful of the state to give them a punishment, if you ask them whether they would be likely to evade paying taxes if they knew their friends, family, and work associates knew, but still they would get away with the punishment from the state, that had a greater effect. More Ukrainians were less willing to evade if they knew their friends, co-workers, or family members knew about it. Unlike in Poland, most Ukrainians have their taxes paid for by their employer, unless, of course, they're earning income from more than one source, and then you do have to file individually. As I did surveys of the general public, which included people who filed for themselves and a mass majority who didn't file for themselves, I found out that the attitudes toward the state did not vary at all. People were very low trusting of the state and of the tax process, regardless of whether they interacted in it directly by filing themselves or whether they had their employers or someone else file. So trust was low across the board and had an impact such that the people, even those who may, for example, have high incomes or in a managerial position and are responsible for filing for employees and others, their attitudes towards the state were very similar to those others generally in society. The other thing is, in the last section of the book, I undertake a variety of suggestions and policy recommendations, if you will, that are geared to states like Ukraine that find themselves transitioning from a state based upon corruption and coercion towards one that's based on the rule of law. And for Ukraine, with this situation where most people have their employers file taxes for them, they don't actually know how much their pre-tax income is. Most people, when they negotiate salaries in Ukraine, they negotiate salaries based upon what the take-home pay is, what the monthly salary is after taxes are taken out. So they don't see or understand per se directly that they may actually, that they actually are paying taxes and that someone is doing this on their behalf. They may vaguely have some understanding of it, but unlike, for example, in a lot of Western countries where you get a pay slip at the end of the month that shows how much your salary was minus all of the taxes and how much your actual take-home pay is, Ukrainians don't get a slip of paper that explains to them what their pre and post-tax salaries are. And I think that's very important for building up a constructive relationship between citizens and their state. Moreover, when there are reforms proposed, as there have been in recent years, about tax rates being increased or decreased and so forth, people don't have a sense of how that would affect them because they don't have a sense of really how much they're paying taxes. So I think as part of any reform process going forward, I strongly recommend that in lieu of actually having individuals file their taxes, that at least citizens get a slip of paper or some sort of information from their employer every month as to how much their salary is before and after tax. In Russia, it's very similar to what happens in Ukraine. Of course, anecdotal evidence suggests that salaries paid in the form of just cash in an envelope are higher in Ukraine than they are even in Russia. In terms of my personal intellectual history that led me to this topic, I was a student and started graduate school in the late 90s and early 2000s, and that was a time in which we saw many post-communist governments not being effective, not able to govern. And I tried to figure out, why is this the case? Why can some states do it and others can't? And how is that going to impact the population within these countries? And then looking at different policy areas to try and figure out and trace through, as an example of this, I came upon tax collection. For the reasons I stated earlier, states cannot exist without taxes being collected. They can't do anything. They can't give out money for social welfare payments and so forth. And at the same time, though, with the exception perhaps of conscription, which is a citizen obligation that affects mostly men between, say, 18 and 26 years old in certain countries like Ukraine, most other obligations of citizenship, such as voting, such as honoring the flag and so forth, don't require giving up as much as tax collection and tax compliance do. So it's a matter of tracing through and recognizing that one of the things economists and financial experts, if you will, have had with respect to a lot of the reforms that started in the 90s, but basically reforms everywhere, they're very much concerned with what are the exact tax rates? what should be the rates that would bring in money for the state? What would be the ideal rates that would enable the economy to grow? But there's an assumption built in there that there is a bureaucracy ready, able, and willing to implement those policies. And one doesn't perhaps have to spend too much time, at least in the 90s and the 2000s, in the former Soviet Union, to recognize that what's written on paper isn't always what's implemented, and often far from it. There are national rates set for the entire country with respect to personal income tax and corporate income taxes and the like. And one of the things I did was I surveyed the general public and asked them, do you know what the tax rates are for something like personal income tax? And in Poland and Russia, there was high recognition of what the rates were. And in Poland, it's a graduated system, perhaps more like Western countries. In Russia, it's been a flat tax regime since 2001. And in Ukraine, it's been a flat tax regime since 2003. And the rates have been almost identical throughout until fairly recently. The rates were almost identical with that of the flat tax rates in Russia. But when I asked the populations of these three countries, the vast majority of Ukrainians had no idea what the personal income tax rates were, even though their counterpart citizens in Poland and Russia did. So there's a greater disconnect between the tax system and citizens in Ukraine. But again, why should they, if a lot of them are, for example, not recognizing that they're having their taxes taken out of their monthly salaries before they get them? I mean, I remember meeting with somebody who is higher up in the Moscow tax police, and I asked him, as I had asked a lot of people, what's the most difficult aspect of your job? What is most troublesome with your work? And he didn't bat an eye, and he said the presumption of innocence. That was an obstacle for catching people that he believed were guilty. There is the regular, I would call it the regular tax offices that are designed to collect revenue, and then various countries have established what are known as the tax police, which are to go after non-compliers, to go after firms that they regard as being highly in violation of the tax rules. And they're often used for political ends as well, meaning that if you or your company is subjected to a visit from the tax police, that likely would shake you up to such an extent that you may fall in line with the way things are deemed ought to be done. But as we know, that Ukraine is a paradigm example of what Henry Hale would call patrimonialism, and the state has been run with effective degree by a certain few or elite at the top, and certainly the extent and nature of the rule has changed quite drastically from Kuchma to Yanukovych to Yushchenko to Yanukovych. I mean, you have these variations going on with respect to that, and certainly some of these institutions, including the tax administration or the tax police, are used by some quite differently depending upon which period of presidential terms you're looking at. But by and large, in a sort of broader sense, those elites, you may call them rich or just happen to be in the right position, are getting away with not, if they are getting away with not paying taxes, they're doing so because there isn't, there's support for them politically, as well as there is not enough oversight into the process of paying taxes and the like. And certainly the struggle that's happened over the last 4 years or so within Ukraine has been a process in which citizens have tried to set up watchdog agencies and reform committees that would be able to oversee the activity of the state. And as I recommend, you need to have watchdog organizations both outside and inside the state itself. Poland, for example, has the Najwyższa Izba Kontroli, the Supreme Audit Chamber, which is an accounting chamber. There are similar organizations in Russia and Ukraine, but they aren't as effective. In Poland, they're given more independence to oversee the activity of a lot of bureaucracies. Not necessarily to oversee it, but to monitor the activity of a lot of bureaucracies and produce reports that are available and open for the public that you can download off the web. Those in-depth reports are not out in the public if they exist in Russia and Ukraine. I think there are those who are looking at Poland when thinking of changes for Ukraine. At the same time, there are difficulties that Ukraine is facing towards having what I would call a more complete or full reform of the tax administration there. There have been a lot of proposals, including disbanding the tax police. The current finance minister, Oleksandr Danylyuk, has been mentioned several times in newspapers over the last year of wanting to see an overhaul of the bureaucracy, a true reform within the tax administration bureaucratic structures. But there isn't support for him or from within the system to do this. And this is sort of the situation that Ukraine generally finds itself in. A lot of great ideas regarding reform, a lot of people who are pushing for reform, but there's also others that are part of the way in which the country is governed and ruled who are reluctant to see change happen to such an extent. Well, let me explain one thing that I think is really important for Ukraine to change and that would tremendously make for a much more effective and cleaner system. And that is that the state passes a budget every year as to how much income it needs and how it intends to spend it. And that is almost a directive to the tax authorities to how much they need to collect in order to meet those spending requirements. And they divide that out at the national level, down to the oblast level, down to cities and rayons and so forth, such that every tax officer working in a tax office has a plan or requirement or a target, if you will, of how much money to collect in every quarter or every financial year and so forth. And when you have these targets saying you need to collect this much, it ensures that when you come towards the end of a quarter or a period of time that you collecting these taxes, you have to find additional money to meet that target. And most likely, you're not going to go out in society and try to find people who never, or firms who never interacted with the state in paying taxes before. Instead, you're going to return to those companies who have paid taxes in the past and have, what their bottom line is, that they have further money, and ask them to pay forward, whether it be, to pay in advance for the next quarter, or try to suggest that you would come back and find problems if they don't pay additional funds and cause them additional fines, such that the process does not reward those who pay their taxes, in full and on time. And in Poland, by contrast, their method of operation is not about ensuring targets. They require their tax offices to ensure compliance and seeking out that the firms and individuals are complying with the rules as they are laid down. They're not given a plan or a target level as such as is directed in Ukraine and to some extent also in Russia. I think one of the early surprises for me, and I had lived in Ukraine for a few years in the 90s before graduate school, but one of the early surprises for me was we all sort of know that Poland is a different country than Russia and the other former Soviet states. But the degree of difference between Russia and Ukraine, as stark as it is, especially in these surveys that I conducted and the results from them, that was really surprising. And many cases, Russians and Ukrainians may have come out of the same Soviet state in 1991, but where they are by the 2000s, they're in completely different trajectories. And their citizens relate and expect different things from their states. And that was quite surprising. They have introduced recent reforms with respect to tax rates and certain tax policies, lowering rates, if you will, to make their companies and country more competitive. What I would like to see, though, is a further, the counterpart to those reforms is actually reforming the administration themselves. On paper, these are simple reforms to do, changing, for example, from a target-based approach to a compliance-oriented approach. But in practice, this means a real overhaul of the system to be able to meet sort of the demands of a more democratically inspired tax administration. There's no doubt that leadership is very important when you're launching a reform, whether it be from the commander-in-chief on top of the whole state, or whether it be somebody who's ruling the finance ministry or the tax administration. There is no doubt that the reform process couldn't go through as well as it did in Poland without a direction from above. And that was certainly the case. The manner in which the tax system was created in 1996 with Mikhail Azarov, who eventually became a prime minister under Yanukovych, had a different emphasis, and that was not as outward oriented. They were not trying to reach every citizen, and in fact, what they're trying to do was control the larger firms. Well, I talk about in the book this aspect of creating a bureaucratically rational state, in many ways inspired by Weber. And while Weber's time was about 100 years or so ago, the impact can be clear and applied to something like modern tax administrations. And I believe that if you were to look under the hood of the state, or if you were here in the UK, you would say the bonnet of the state, and look to see how the sort of the engine and how everything inside worked, you would find that it would be important to look at how there are historical reference points to past times in which the state has been viewed to have been competent and effective in implementing things. And Poland, Russia, and Ukraine each reached back to the past differently. Poland did so by building a lot upon the memory and the legacy of institutions from the interwar period, the last time when Poland was governed of, by, and for Poles, roughly between 1918 until the 30s. Russia's reference, certainly under Putin, has been a strong Soviet hierarchical state, albeit absent a communist party, in trying to recreate a government that can govern effectively, and doing so out of a coercive manner. Ukraine did not have as much of a legacy to refer back to, was very uncertain as to what independence meant for the state throughout the 1990s, did not engage in strong sort of bureaucratic state-led reforms. And in many cases, that led to some uncertainty as to what these new agencies should be doing and how they should be designed. But then once they are designed, you need to look at the structures of the state, how they interact, also how they provide for communication outwards towards the public, and what work philosophies they provide. And all of these attributes I go through and try to trace through within the three states in their tax administrations. And in the final chapter, which of course is open for discussion, I lay out a series of policy recommendations and proposals based upon these different aspects as to how the state could change in order to become more rational in a bureaucratic sense. Danylyuk has obviously been in office for almost a year now, and is very well good intentioned towards the types of reforms you would like to see. My first question would be, why do you think you can't implement some of these reforms? What interest groups, what where the blockages, so to speak, that would prevent you from having a more complete overhaul of the tax bureaucracy in order to reorientate, for example, the work philosophy towards one in which tax officers are not being paid or judged by how much money they bring in, but are judged by how much they ensure citizens are complying with the tax laws. So I'd be curious to know where these obstacles he believes there are, where there, and suggest mechanisms perhaps for having intermediate reforms in view to a larger reform when there's such a possibility. As your audience, I imagine, is first and foremost interested in Ukraine, and in many ways, this is a book trying to figure out where this state, Ukraine, is in between the two sort of ideal types or paradigms of a democratic Poland and a more authoritarian Russia. One of the things that's been very surprising in these surveys I've been doing with the Razumkov Center is how little trust there is among citizens in Ukraine today towards their state. And whereas before the Euromaidan, we had about 3 nationwide surveys, and about 12% of the population said they trusted their state to provide them with goods and services. They trusted their state to do what is right. They trusted the state to do what is treat them fairly. And meanwhile, about 20 to 24% of Poles and Russians also had that state. Of course, those are low numbers in Poland and Russia as well. And we live in a time globally where people are not trusting their states. But at the same time, this figure of 12% was quite low. But then again, in 2015, we surveyed again, and that figure was cut in half. That is just a few years after the Euromaidan revolution, only 6 or 7% of the country trust their state to provide them with goods and services, trust their state to do what is right. That is got to be horrifically low. And for anyone who's concerned about the future of Ukraine and where the state is going, where society is going, this huge disconnect is not shrinking, it's growing in recent years. People don't trust their states to be run properly in that country. They have a lot of perhaps rational reasons to do so, maybe even a rational reason to avoid paying taxes. If you don't feel as if you're getting anything from your state, it's rationally not to comply, especially if you can get away with it. So I hope that those who are in a position of power and leadership recognize that in so many ways the problems that have occurred and the revolutions that have resulted in the last couple of decades in Ukraine have been resulting from the fact that there's this huge disconnect between state and society, and that has got to be bridged. And it cannot be sort of flat, put a lacquer finish on it to make it look nice to the outside world or to look nice to those governing. It's there, and there needs to be I would say a new revolution as to how people perceive of what their government can do for them. Thanks, it was a real pleasure. I think this is a great endeavor that you're doing, and I know there's a lot of support for Ukraine, especially in North America, and to reach out to those folks, I think would be most helpful. Thanks, good luck to you, and happy reading.